Thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks for everybody who has come to listen to the talk. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Harald Wydra. I'm a professor of politics. I'm actually a fellow in another college, but I've been teaching for Corpus in the last 7 years. So I teach politics and international relations. And as you might appreciate, these times right now are very moved and very exciting, so to speak, very interesting times. It's not always great to live in interesting times, but it's absolutely right to say that it's absolutely interesting and fascinating to analyze, to explore these fascinating times. So when I decided to run this masterclass under that topic, towards a new Cold War, Russia and the West, that was before the invasion happened on the 24th of February. And that was an event that was, by many analysts, not foreseen in the way it actually unfolded. I was one of those who thought the likelihood of an invasion would be certainly a certain percentage, 20–30%, if that makes any sense. But I was actually quite surprised. Anyhow, what is important is to realize that when we want to study a subject like international relations or politics, you had on the poster introducing that masterclass a picture of the famous Leviathan, the famous picture by Thomas Hobbes on the frontispiece of his book Leviathan, which is, in a way, a metaphor for how we understand modern politics as the state, as this overpowering institution, this disciplinary mechanism. So politics and international relations are interwoven, so to speak. One cannot be seen without the other. And this is what I want to do today, is to look at that question, the question that I outlined in the talk, for this talk. Are we heading for a new Cold War? But we must try to do that by keeping our head quite cool, although emotions are running high and blood is flowing constantly, primarily in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine. Of course, there are other conflict hotspots in the world, for instance, in Yemen, which are largely forgotten because the focus of the attention of the world press is rightly on this aggressive warfare by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. So how to keep our heads cool? That's not always easy. I mean, I myself grew up in West Germany, and when Vladimir Putin mentioned or declared 2 or 3 days into that aggressive warfare in Ukraine that he had put the nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation under, an increased alert. There are 4 levels of alertness. Now I think we are at level 2. I was very much reminded of my time in West Germany, where we actually in the 1980s lived under quite a serious nuclear threat, and we had regular alarms ringing and sort of like disrupting the school day at the time. So it's a bit of a déjà vu, and that actually brings me to like what I would like to do with you today. I mean, I would like to discuss 4 points, which I have to do, to a certain degree with a certain simplicity, but still I would like to gain some analytical depth, because this is what we usually do here. We try to understand political relations and the relations between states from a relatively, engaged way and engaged approach, but still, as I already said, with a relatively cool head, because the worst thing that can happen when you try to understand international relations is to get too emotional about them. I completely understand that it is impossible, to be completely emotionless. And as the poster already indicated, you are here to explore your passion. And if you were admitted to Cambridge, you could really explore this passion. So it's good to have passion, right? But it's also very important to step back and to try to look at a certain problem 2 or 3 or 4 times and get, and cool down a little bit. So this is what I'm trying to do today. Now, I would like to, first of all, I would like to share my screen and just indicate very briefly what I'm trying to do. Sort of like I would like to just briefly outline 4 points. First, what was the Cold War? Second, what changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991? Third, what I call the Cold Peace. How did we move from the Cold Peace to a new Cold War? Always with a question mark, because the question of whether there will be a new Cold War is still, to be decided. And I will also explain what I mean by the Cold Peace. And the fourth point, the last point, is to say or to ask, are we looking at a struggle between democracy and autocracy, or is something else going on as well? As you might be very keen observers of the press, you might realize that President Biden has used this kind of opposition several times. Last time, yesterday, or was it 2 days ago, in the speech that he gave in Warsaw, declaring that this is a fight between democracy and autocracy. So I just would like to have some thoughts shared with you on that question. And I would like to now move to one picture that will be basically the background to our talk today, and that is this picture here, where we see NATO enlargement. That is informative, but it's also informative in terms of, who are member countries and how NATO has expanded into Eastern Europe, closer to the Russian Federation. But also, quite importantly, it gives us a little bit of a view on, what Europe is, where certain states can be found, and where Russia is, and how the geostrategic situation actually looks like. I say this because it is always very instructive to look at maps to see geography. Not that I think geography is the only important aspect, but definitely geography and territory matters. And that's actually a first point already. Most of you, all of you, have been growing up in a world that we call a globalized world. You hear about globalization, and that has many, many different meanings to it. But one thing is, and I don't want to go into them, but I think one thing is quite uncontroversial, namely that globalization has made territory, so to speak, less important, right? You might wonder, why does a state have to attack another state? Why don't they continue competing with their economies, putting better products on the market, pushing certain, innovation, trying to become a more attractive model of economic progress, of the level of salaries, just to try to compete in the way that we have been used to in the last 30 or 40 years, namely that warfare is not about killing people, but the way states compete with each other is mainly on the economic in the economic field. And we have seen that territory still matters. And this is what brings me back to the first question that I outlined in the little overview of what today's lecture is about, namely, what was actually the Cold War? Now, you might have studied history, you might have studied politics, you might have heard stories about the Cold War, you must have seen quite a few films and movies. And the first association that comes to mind is, oh yes, it's a systemic struggle. It's two blocks, right? The block of freedom led by the United States and the block of socialism, communism led by the Soviet Union. They had different political models. One was democratic, capitalist. The other one was, some say, totalitarian, certainly authoritarian, and socialist, mainly with economies that were centrally planned, that had little room for private initiative, but they were engaged in a struggle for ruling the world, right? The metaphor or the symbol of that Cold War was the Berlin Wall. In the middle of this picture, you see, I'm showing it with a cursor here, you have West Germany still and East Germany divided. So East Germany, this one here, was part of the Warsaw Pact, which was the military alliance dominated by the Soviet Union, and West Germany was part of NATO. So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was originally set up in 1949 under the guidance of the US and had originally 12 member states. And the idea was to create an alliance that would draw together and assemble under an institutional roof the North Atlantic, sort of like North American United States and Canada, together with Western European countries, in order to show a militarily robust sign to what was building up on the other side of Europe as a potential, not only competitor, but as a potential threat to the peace and freedom of democratic countries in Western Europe, right? So this is how NATO was born. I mean, I cannot really go into the motivations of either the United States and the Soviet Union, how they actually became opponents and even enemies, whilst during World War II, they had been fighting on one side against Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. So here, and this is already gives us an inkling of what actually was at stake here and what is potentially at stake today, because Russia, as the follow-up, the successor nation to the Soviet Union, had cultivated the image, and rightly so, to have liberated Europe from the worst dictatorship that had ever existed, the Nazi German Hitler dictatorship. But sort of like that is something that I will discuss at the very end. So the Cold War was this big competition, the big rivalry between two blocks. Some would argue two big empires, right? I would say that the word empire makes a certain sense in terms of if you see the reach and the diffusion and the influence of each country, then you can argue that the United States and the Soviet Union, with their models of economic and political organization, penetrated much of the world, much of the globe. They were not, the United States is not strictly speaking an empire, it is a republic, right? So it's self-constituted, not on the basis of one center occupying other parts of the country and then establishing a political hierarchy, a political leadership. But the United States have come together as sort of like based on this idea that people organize themselves voluntarily in a political system that they call republic. Nevertheless, the United States took over many of the positions that had been possessed by the British Empire beforehand. The British Empire at that very time, between the 1945 and 1960s, was in massive decline, losing many of the territories it had possessed. The United States didn't take over all these territories, but they really stepped into the vacuum, expanding their influence all over the world. So in that sense, some argued that the United States was the empire of liberty. On the other hand, you had the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was the successor state, so to speak, to the Russian Empire. And Russia in itself is a country that has been established as an empire. So the fact that Russia today is composed, the Russian Federation is composed of 17 republics and 89 oblasts, which are regional organizations, and has further a number of further smaller autonomous regions. It has many dozens of languages, and only 80% of that population in the Russian Federation is actually ethnically Russian. And many of the republics around Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, and even countries like Latvia still have sizable ethnic Russian minorities. You might have heard about it because this is one of the reasons alleged by Putin and his regime for why a war against Ukraine is justified, to protect Russian minorities. And that was actually the major reason why Crimea, which is here, right? This is this little piece of land, this peninsula in the Black Sea, was annexed in 2014. So Russia has grown so massively in between the 1600s and the 20th century because it was pushed by a monarchical autocratic state, and it occupied territory after territory. So strictly speaking, the Soviet Union, although its ideology was precisely the opposite of an empire, the ideology was all about the equality of people, primarily the emancipation of workers, and the idea that political and social life, should not be guided by economic interests and by elites, or by exploiting elites, by rich capitalists, but rather by a form of social and political organization that should give priority to those who had been at the bottom of the social hierarchy, right? So the ideology of the Soviet Union was very much anti-imperial, it was anti-nationalist, it was anti-capitalist, but at the same time, this regime came to light and came to life in a place where the whole tradition, the whole ideological tradition was actually one of empire. So you could call the Soviet Union an empire of justice that tried to implement justice in the way its ideology commanded it, right? The justice in terms of there should be no private enterprise, the state should control everything, and priority should be given to ensure a decent life where the basic needs would be ensured. So everybody would get a job, people would get housing, they would get very cheap transport, but you would not be able to produce, for instance, an electric toaster. There were no electric toasters in the Soviet Union, and there were very few commodities of good quality. For instance, very few and not very good cars, not very good television sets, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the Soviet Union put all its or much of its resources into the arms race with the United States. And it's famous, and you might have heard about it, that the Soviets were very successful. I mean, they launched the first satellite, the Sputnik, into cosmos, and they had the first man in 1961 in the cosmos, Yuri Gagarin, so the first one who completed several tours around Earth. So they were very, very successful in that regard, but they were rather, not so very successful because it wasn't in their planning, to create a state, a society that would be attractive to people and where people could increase their living standards. So that Cold War had many highlights in quotation marks, and they were rather critical and very dangerous highlights in terms of the way the world actually scraped through and avoided just by very little and nuclear confrontation, because this is one of the major problems in the Cold War, that conventional warfare was, I wouldn't say substituted, but it was topped by the fact that both sides would have a nuclear weapon, and therefore new logic of deterrence kicked in, and that would lead to many confrontations. Most famous is, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets aimed to deploy missiles very close to the American mainland in Cuba, and it was just, the tensions got very high, and the world was really very, very close to nuclear confrontation. 1962. Luckily, that didn't happen. There were also great tensions when 1961, when the East German regime built a wall through Berlin in 1961, and that became sort of then the symbol of the Cold War in Europe. But we have also to realize that whilst there was no direct confrontation of Soviet and US soldiers, for instance, and this is actually something that is quite important today when you hear the pleas by Ukrainian President Zelensky to impose a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, which would actually mean that NATO aircraft would basically potentially shoot down Russian aircraft, right? Otherwise, you cannot establish a no-fly zone. What NATO desperately wants to avoid is the direct confrontation, the direct military confrontation between Russian and NATO soldiers, something that was actually avoided in the Cold War. However, there were many, many so-called proxy wars. So the Cold War was cold, so to speak, in Europe, but it was rather hot in many hot spots in the world, in the so-called third world, right? So the word third world is today often used or considered to be a bit defamatory or you know, basically disrespectful of countries that are perhaps not as developed as others. But it originally meant that the third world was the world, which wasn't the first and wasn't the second world. So in that sense, the first world and the second world were the worlds that were confronted with each other in the Cold War. And the third world was sort of that world of countries that didn't have a concrete allegiance to any of these countries, and could also be seen as non-aligned states. Yugoslavia was here. This is what Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia were when they were together in Yugoslavia, sort of like that was in a way part of that third world. And most of the decolonizing world, the world, those countries that had been former colonies of Britain and of France mainly, and were sort of like looking either for independence, and this independence was often not to be gotten or completed without massive aid, without massive assistance, technical assistance, administrative assistance, logistical assistance, which would, by definition, need to come from the developed world, right? The developed world of the liberal capitalist camp, or the developed world from the sort of like Soviet communist camp. And here, and I come to a close now regarding my first point, what was the Cold War, is that you had several proxy wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan. Okay, the second point, you know, what happened actually when the Soviet Union collapsed? Well, the Soviet Union collapsed. What happened was that Germany achieved unification, largely with the aid of the last General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, who accepted that. That was in 1990, before the Soviet Union collapsed. That was one major achievement in a way that actually changed the architecture of security, but also the architecture of political allegiance, so to speak, in the region, because East Germany would move towards a West German liberal democratic system. And these parts here, you know, we're talking here about Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, who had been part of the Eastern Bloc, had, you know, didn't want to stay neutral or in that buffer zone between what then would become the Russian Federation and the European Union. So a new way, a new sort of like direction had to be found. It was quite grudgingly and not with great enthusiasm, actually, that the European Union decided, European community at that time decided that some perspective had to be opened for these countries to be to fulfill their wishes and their dreams, and they were to move towards Western institutions. First of all, to increase the likelihood for their economies to become more competitive, to become also more flourishing, and to raise the living standards of their populations. And second, to introduce democratic systems. Third, also to create a possibility for them to improve their security. And their security would mean basically to enter NATO, to have a standardized and institutionalized protection against potential attempts by Russia to threaten this liberty and the status of the country. For instance, Poland had been part of the Russian Empire for 100 years in the 19th century, right? So Poland knows very well what it is to have Russia as a neighbor. The Soviet Union had invaded, as you might know, Hungary in 1956, and 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 Czechoslovakia in 1968 to basically suppress revolution, so to speak, more opening up political liberalization. And Russia, the Soviet Union was dissolved, and it was dissolved by a treaty amongst different republics. The Soviet Union had been a conglomerate of different republics, and the Ukrainian Republic was one of them, right? So in December 1991, they decided to dissolve the union and to make all these republics independent states, right? What followed was a very troubled time for Russia. It was a very troubled time, the troubled 90s, where the state became weak, it lost control, it had to sell out many of its assets. Mainly the Russian economy relied on the extraction of natural resources and the export of these resources. And one main reason why there are oligarchs, that means super rich individuals, is the fact that many individuals with good contacts in the Soviet Communist Party took the opportunity and got hold of these assets at that time and made a huge fortune out of that. At the same time, there were two currency reforms. There was hyperinflation, there was mass unemployment, and there was a default in 1998 with a massive devaluation of the ruble. And that all led to a sense that Russia was really on the brink of chaos and anarchy. And that was one of the reasons for why Boris Yeltsin, who had been the president of Russia in the 1990s, when he looked for a successor, opted for Vladimir Putin, who came from a career in the secret services and promised to be, in a way, a hardliner in the sense of trying to keep that country together by often rather quite desperate and authoritarian measures. I can't really explain here in detail what that meant, but it would mean certainly that the Russian state would become more controlled from the Moscow center. That doesn't mean that the regions would not have a certain level of independence, because Russia is such a big country that can't really be controlled from the very center. And this is also one of the reasons why the prospect of becoming a new North Korea, right, is you might have heard that in the press, that the Russian regime has currently cracked down on practically all of independent journalism. It has basically made political, and not even political, but even humanitarian and cultural associations that are not in line with the state line illegal by calling them foreign agents. So there is a massive attempt in Russia today to streamline political opinion, to streamline socially independent initiatives, but that may, in the long run, not be possible in a place like Russia that is so varied and so huge. But to come back to the post-Soviet period and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and why under Putin, especially after 2003, after the Iraq War, and after the Ukrainian Revolution in 2004, Putin, who originally was a Westernizer and a good friend of Tony Blair and George Bush, became much more reticent and much more engaged in trying to increase the influence of the Russian Federation on what is called the near abroad. So the near abroad is basically all the republics that have broken away from the Soviet Union: Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, which is not on the map here, other Central Asian countries, Georgia in the Caucasus, And you could call that period between 2004 and 2014 the Cold Peace, so to speak, a peace, an arrangement between Russia and the West. But as you already see, the West moving with its security alliance, NATO, further to the east, in a way exploiting the weakness of the Russian Federation, and even including countries of the former Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 2004 into the alliance of NATO. And that is, and also Romania and Bulgaria. So, and that is in a way one of the sort of like the argumentative line of the Putin regime is, of course, that here we have a security threat, a massive security threat to the Russian Federation coming from NATO expansion into our, basically into our, you know, close to our living room, basically, right? Into our backyard, certainly. But so I can't really discuss that in detail. There have been many tensions. Russia has withdrawn its permanent representative to NATO a while ago, and there are definitely genuine, I mean, to a certain extent, genuine security risks. But I think what is more important for Russia is the fact that in some countries around its borders, there have been attempts to change the regime. Even Belarus, where there has been one single ruler ever since 1991, Lukashenko, had massive protests last year. Ukraine had two revolutions. It toppled the former president Yanukovych in 2013-14. And there have been recently unrest in Kazakhstan. There has been a kind of revolution, a popular uprising in Kyrgyzstan. So I think the major question for the Russian regime is also, maybe even the primary question, that regime change, that popular rebellion, that the greater self-affirmation of civil society may be what this regime fears fundamentally. And that brings me to the fourth point. And the fourth point is fundamentally, are we now in a time where it's really democracy against autocracy? Now, that is a very fascinating question for which I have now 5 minutes, which is near impossible to answer. But the whole lecture actually should be there for you to ask further questions. You know, we are here in Cambridge, and we want our students to write great essays and to do very well in their exams and to learn a lot and to know things. But I think it's more important even to ask questions, and certainly to ask questions regarding what you hear in the press and what you hear by, you know, politicians, governments, how you look at the world. So when you look at the world today and you have this absolutely unbearable, aggressive war that is, destroying entire cities in Ukraine, having led to nearly 4 million people having to leave the country, but it's also affecting the Russians, who as a whole are in a way hostage to a regime that is more and more entrenched. I'm not saying that it's at the end of its days, but it's more and more entrenched and has to find desperate measures to stay in power. So a war that would potentially affect these two countries in a massive way, both economically and in Ukraine, of course, also regarding you know, the huge loss of life and the huge destruction and the fact that so many people had to flee. So there is definitely a point to be made about the democratic world standing together against this highly authoritarian and a regime that is isolated from the large part of its society, and actually survives mainly because of a propaganda apparatus that it's been running in the last 20 years and cutting down on public opinion, on free public opinion. But at the same time, we must never forget that each of the countries in the West, and they luckily appear to be quite united at this moment, they still have very different agendas. They have their own interests. A state like the US has a vision and a national interest that is not really that of Turkey or that of Norway or that of Italy, but to a large extent they overlap, of course, right? So especially in times of crisis, especially in times of threat, and you may argue existential threat, and if the further you go to Eastern Europe, the closer and the more intense the existential threat is. Imagine, some bombs fall on Poland or on Romania, and what will NATO do then? It has to defend one of its member states. So I would say that when we hear these announcements in great speeches given and of high symbolic value, that it's now democracy versus autocracy, we always must take it with a certain level of caution, and we must look, what is behind there. Are there not also very strong interests in trying to produce a regime change in Russia? And that's, of course, the big questions, especially after Biden's words that this man Putin cannot remain in power. Are we talking about regime change? How likely is that? Is this not rather dangerous, to meddle with internal affairs of a country, even if this country is threatening the peace of Europe and the peace of the world? So I think we are in very dangerous times. There is no doubt about it. I can't really predict, and this is not a predictive science, by the way. Human, social, and political science are not predictive science. We can give perhaps some diagnosis, but we shouldn't play politicians, I think. We should look at politicians, we should look at the discourse, we should look at it with a cool head, right? And we should be engaged, but we should sort of always have the necessary detachment to read things, especially like the one, democracy versus autocracy, with a pinch of salt and take that rather cautiously. And I'm very happy to see, now I'm at the end of my lecture, and I'm very happy to have some 3 engaged students who will now guide you through the nitty-gritty of the real student experience, I suppose, and the real student experience also of teaching and learning about international relations and perhaps what they think is going on. But I suppose that you will be interested also more in practical matters. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Just before you go, Harald, we've got a couple of questions that have come up from your talk. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you them. This is from Theo, and he asks, how significant are the security issues presented by Russian aggression to the Baltic states?
I mean, they are of course significant. I mean, there are. Well, the question is, I mean, does the question ask whether they could be invaded? Whether there could be Russian agents, for instance, trying to destabilize the system? That may all be possible, but I think at the moment Putin knows very well that if he really touches a NATO member, the sort of consequences would be completely incommensurable. So I don't, and I also think that the Russian military at the moment has shown that it's badly prepared, that it's quite overstretched. So I don't think we will go there, and I don't think either that Putin is ready to push the nuclear button, because he didn't start off as a risk taker, and I think what he miscalculated this time is really he miscalculated the the strength and unity of its opposition. So I think that is that these populations over there are really nervous, right? Like they are in Poland, but I don't think that the Russian regime at the moment is actually capable of going anywhere near, like militarily.
This is a question, I'm not sure who asked this, but do you think collective security or balance of power leads to a greater degree of stability when applied correctly?
I mean, that's of course a great question. It's the question people in international relations have quarreled over a century. What I can say is that in the before 2014, let's say, you could say that that people have, the wider population would have thought that balance of power is not so important anymore. Collective security has become more important because there has been a new liberal world order in a globalized world. Some countries produce, others provide the national resources, for instance, the Russian Federation. Now we see that collective security doesn't really, I mean, collective security in the sense of NATO, yes, but the UN, for instance, the collective security apparatus, has issued many resolutions, but these resolutions don't really bite. So we are back to a kind of balance of power world, which we actually never left, right? And this is what I said when I said democracy versus autocracy makes only sense if you read behind that, you know, who is actually standing there, right? I mean, if you have China, if you have the together with Qatar and the Arab states, you know, who are in a way strange allies, but some of them are also allies with the Western world, right? So you have to read behind that democracy versus the autocracy thing. The democracy versus autocracy works very well when it's very hot, where it's getting really, really dangerous. But then, you know, you will find new alliances. So this balance of power thing will always exist, but I would, last word, say that you should always hope that collective security in one way or the other applies as well.
Yeah. So now that we start questions, like more questions are pouring in, but I'm conscious that we've got our undergraduates here. Yeah, if we can we have one more? We'll have one more, I think, Harald, if that's okay. And thank you patiently waiting, Luca, Jacob, and Aaron. This is a question: do you think that Ukraine and other ex-Soviet countries who border Russia will always have to accept the prospect of losing some of their territory, I suppose, as the price of avoiding conflict?
I can ask. Okay, I can answer that with another question. I mean, I'm not sure that Russia will remain one country. You know, it could well be that if there is a destabilization of the system, and this is, by the way, one of the reasons why the West doesn't necessarily want to push for regime change, because after Putin, you don't know what you're getting. Will you get something you got in Libya, where they ousted one dictator, and ever since there have been sort of like different civil war factions. So that's sort of assuming that Russia remains one country. It very much depends on the type of regime you have there. The more democratized a regime, the more a regime will accept the rules that are sort of like the rules of trade and commerce, the less likely this will be. The more, if you have another revolution, I'm not really sure what's going to happen in Russia. Revolutions have never brought good things to Russia, I think. So fundamentally, yes, the risk exists, especially in Ukraine, because Ukraine is the center of Russian imperial ideology, right? And don't delude yourself. Even if there will be a peace agreement, or at least a ceasefire, you know, what will happen with the territories already occupied by Russia? Putin cannot lose his face. He has to have something like a victory parade somewhere. Will it happen in Kiev? Hopefully not. Will it happen in Donetsk? Probably. Will he give away the Crimea? You know, getting the Crimea in 2014 was popular across all. I mean, Navalny, the major opposition figure, was for getting Crimea back to Russia. So this is almost impossible to resolve, right? So the points are: will Russia remain one country? What will be the regime type in the future? Will Russia retreat from parts of Ukraine or not? I can't really see that under Putin that it will. I can't really see what kind of, I mean, there may be an internal coup in some years, that could be, but that you don't know what will happen after, especially given the fact that Russia is such a system. Either you have a regional system with federal states in Russia, there is no tradition to ground that, or you have to rule that country with a rather centralized system. So the democratization of Russia is not really in the books at the moment. And as long as it isn't, many of the countries around its borders must fear for territorial revisionism.
Very interesting. And just one more thing. I mean, if anyone was interested and wanted to potentially read something a bit more about some of the themes you've been talking about, Harald, is there any sort of one book or article that you would recommend?
Well, there is a good book that came out quite recently. I'm just writing it. It's up here in the chat. Okay. That came out in 2021. It's very recent.
Yes, everyone should be able to see. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah, I can just so that. Yeah, thank you. I think everyone can see. Can everyone see that? Possibly not. Yeah, everyone should be able to see that. Okay. I'd like to thank you very much for your time, Harald. It's very, very interesting.
I'm writing down another one, which is a book by a historian, but it's sort of like a good. It puts sort of like the finger on the bigger global picture, and from there you can learn a lot about our situation today.
Great. Thank you very much, and also taking your time to answer some questions as well.